I arrive home to find a small circus on my front lawn. Michael and Roger were arguing. Lauren would interject every now and again, but was being roundly ignored by the two men. Roger was clearly getting angry, and Michael was red-faced as he waved his hands in indignation. I sat for a count of 30, watching the two of them argue, before getting out and approaching the trio. Michael and Roger looked at me as I approached, and both seemed like they wanted to start shouting again when I asked them what was going on. Michael, however, was a little quicker on the draw. Your husband called a priest from St. DeMarco's and asked him to bless the house. I was silent for a moment before asking him what the problem was. Michael looked at me as if I were an utter fool. We've only just started our investigation. You have to give us enough time to complete it so we can get rid of the... No disrespect, Michael, Roger cut him off abruptly, but I mostly just watched you run around my house with a camera last night. This is the second night in a row I have watched creatures beyond my control destroy my house. With all due respect, I'm taking this to the professionals. Michael looked affronted. Looked like he meant to say more, but in the end, all he could do was shake his head. Have it your way, but don't say I didn't warn you. You aren't the first family to think they could take the easy way out of this and regret it. The pair of them went tromping across the lawn, Lauren looking back as they came to the street. She seemed to want to say more, and when she turned, Michael reached for her. Lauren shrugged him off and rounded on the pair of us hotly. She spoke to both of us, but her eyes bore into me, leading me to believe her message was directed my way. We are probably the only two who can stop this. You'll learn that, though it may be too late by then. Roger and I waited for them to leave before going into the house. We walked right into another fight. Why didn't you tell me you'd called a priest? He was up on a stepladder, taking down the cameras and putting them in a box. That had been his first task after changing clothes. He seemed to relish having them gone. He was being careful, but you could tell that he really didn't want to be. I had no idea what Michael had said to him before I got there, what they had said to each other, but it seemed like their friendship had probably ended. I had seen him like this a few times since we'd gotten married, and it was how he got right before he prepared to shut down. It seemed weird to have been so mad just half an hour before now. I spent almost an hour defending these two people, these two complete strangers, and at the time, it had seemed so natural. They were my friends, and I couldn't let her talk about them like that. Now, from the lens of an hour in the future, it seemed odd to have so vehemently defended people who were basically strangers to me. Maybe Valerie West had felt this way after a certain sleepover, I thought. Like you consulted me before you went to the Chavez's? He asked. I wanted to get mad, but he had a point. Since when do you put stock in religion anyway? Like I've said before, Michael was never particularly spiritual. He had been raised Baptist, but he hadn't been to church since my parents dragged him up to Easter service a few years ago. He always talks sarcastically about overly religious people, and he was the last person I would have thought would go talk to a priest about his problems. When I mentioned this, he only shrugged. Well, in all the movies, they always call a priest to get the spooks out, right? I laughed, I couldn't help it, and asked him why he really contacted a priest. Well, he said, I went to the library to try to get some information about the house. This was after you suggested bringing in the Chavez's, but before we saw the creatures. You were sleeping off the night before, and I decided to try and see if anything like this had ever happened in the house before. At the time, I was seeing if the house had ever appeared in the local news. I was hoping for an easy answer, some mineral deposit beneath the house, or naughty kids who'd harassed the previous owners. But it turned out that the house had been empty for quite some time before we moved in. It had, however, made the papers for a disappearance. A previous owner had lost a daughter, the West family. When I asked the librarian if they had any more information about the disappearances in the house, she got very interested. My blood ran cold. Did she have glasses? Hair in a bun? Roger nodded. Yeah, have you met her? She recommended that I call Father Dominic and get him to bless the house. She said that a friend of hers had called him, but something had happened before she could make an appointment with him. Valerie West? I asked, and he turned on the stepladder and fixed me with a strange look. Yeah. How did you know that? I told him about what the librarian had told me. I told him about the ledgers, the scrapbook, the journal. I told him about the families that lived here before us, the fire at the antique store, the Hendersons, the Greens, the Dents, the Wests, the whole sad story. He came down off his stepladder and listened to me as I spilled the whole thing out. I felt bad at the end for getting mad about him seeing a priest. After all, I certainly hadn't told him about my meeting today, had I? When is he coming? The priest, I mean, I asked sheepishly. Friday. Father Dominic said he needed to take a few days to get some things together. He's apparently never performed an exorcism before. Go figure. We spent the rest of the day taking down the cameras and loading them into a box. I could imagine the Chavezes seething next door as we cut their camera feeds. We were careful not to damage any of their equipment, and when we were finished, Michael took them and put them on their front porch. He rang the bell and left, but they were still there when he got back to the front porch. As upsetting as it was to have our budding friendship dashed, it was kind of a relief to have the cameras out of the house. When the sun came up, though, I found myself wishing we had just left them in. Maybe someone would have seen what happened that night. We were in the bedroom, getting ready for bed when it happened. We'd eaten our dinner in the kitchen, discussing how we would have to start working on next week's entry to the blog if we wanted to afford our bills. We had put our blog and cooking podcast on 2-week hiatus when we moved, but our allotted time was quickly running out. As the sun went down, however, we found ourselves looking around expectantly. The house had grown eyes, and we both felt constantly watched, cameras or no. We moved our plans into the living room, but that still didn't feel safe enough. Eventually, we were sitting in bed, going over plans for what we would do tomorrow. We had just finished a rough draft of the article we would post on Wednesday when something shoved our refrigerator down. I know this because I found it turned over the following day at the bottom of a mess. I lunged off the bed, running for the bedroom door so I could close it against any intrusions. I just reached it when I saw the hall light go out, bathing the hall in a ghostly glow. Suddenly, the white demonic face swam out of it and ran for the door. I slammed it with all my might and leaned against it as it began to rattle and buck in the frame. Out in the house, things were being destroyed. It sounded as though every piece of furniture was being flipped. Every item was being knocked or thrown to the ground. The clamor was so loud, I thought they might have pulled the cabinets off the walls. Roger went to the closet, but couldn't find his shotgun. I reminded him that it probably wouldn't do us much good unless it shot holy water, and he came back to brace the door with me as something battered at it. We both leaned there for what seemed like days, until suddenly, it stopped. We both slumped against the door, tired and sore as our adrenaline began to taper off. Roger suddenly rocketed forward, though, as something split the door from the back. His head was bloody, and I could see gleaming metal as an axe head stuck through the front of the door. We retreated to the bathroom then, and shoved the cabinet we had beside the door in front of it. The sounds of the bedroom being ransacked were heartbreaking, and I'm not ashamed to say that most of my night was spent crying in the bathtub. Roger put a towel against his head, the cut little more than a scalp wound, and he put his back against the sturdy old cabinet. They rattled the door, slammed it, chopped at it, but the cabinet held fast, and they soon gave it up so they could go back to destroying the house. We sat huddled in the bathroom, listening to it all go on, and clutching each other for comfort. Then, after what must have been hours, there was merciful silence. We sat, listening to the silence like scared deer. Roger had just gotten up to check the bathroom door when something loud hit the front door. Roger staggered back to the bathtub, where I had been sitting with my knees against my chest. The house was full of incomprehensible yelling and the sounds of boots heading up the hallway. What the hell was this? This wasn't the same as before. This was different. And as it came closer to our hiding place, I buried my face against Roger's chest and begged whoever was listening for this to stop. When the police kicked in our bathroom door, guns drawn, I thought both of us might have a heart attack. One of my neighbors had called the police on the scene, and they had actually shown up. The police said they had suspected it was a domestic, but the state of the house made them think burglary when they first saw it. They said things had been moving in the house when they first arrived, but a search of the house had turned up nothing. They searched it again, an ambulance coming to check us out, and as we sat on the back bumper of the ambulance, I told Roger that he might want to call the priest and see if he could come tomorrow instead. He agreed. The next night, Father Dominic stepped into our house with all the pomp and circumstance of a cardinal. He was dressed as one would expect a priest to be. He wore a long tan coat over his priestly vestments. When he hung it up, I could see the long black robe I had expected. His head was shaved, gleaming like the guy on the cleaner bottle, and his collar was starched and crisp. He carried a small satchel with him, and he looked around dubiously when we invited him in. Whatever they were had destroyed the shambles of our home. The kitchen was mostly clean now, but the cabinets still gaped open, and the fridge made a weird sputtery noise now. The living room carpet still crunched a little with glass, and the night air came right in through the windows that had been broken 2 nights ago. We offered him tea as he looked at the destruction, and he said that would be lovely. As he drank, he went room to room and looked at the chaos. "Are you certain that this is the work of malicious spirits?" he asked. Roger and I only looked at each other and shrugged. "I ask because I have felt no malicious energy in your house. It feels clean, if you'll pardon the expression. I will be more than happy to bless your home, but I wonder if it will have any effect at all." He opened his satchel and took out a stole, which he looped about his neck. He had also brought a vial of holy water, Roger having informed him of our problems at length, and a piece of the host, which he kept in a dish. He also had a crucifix and a well-worn Bible, just in case, he said. He moved through the house, blessing it and the inhabitants in the name of God the Father, and calling for his protection, and on and on and on. As a lapsed Baptist, I didn't follow all of it, but I got the gist. He finished in the kitchen, the focal point it seemed, and he asked us to clasp hands with him as he prayed. He had barely begun when the lights went out and we were left in near total darkness. The priest stuttered over his prayers momentarily, but picked up the threads masterfully. He continued to pray, inviting us to pray with him, and as the prayer swelled, I could feel our space being invaded by the familiar presence. I peeked, opening my eyes a little, and jumped as I noticed a pair of masked entities not far away. I blinked. I had expected there to be one, but there were 2. One was definitely bulkier than the other, but they both stood near 15 feet away and stared at us through the eyes of those white porcelain masks. The priest and Roger had their eyes shut, deep in prayer, and that's why they missed the 2 figures as they stood watching our little powwow. That's why they missed it when they ran at us, knives coming out. I cried out, backing away from the table, and that was all that saved my life. The 2 of them vaulted the table and leapt at Roger and the priest. Both went down in total surprise as the pair rode them to the ground. The priest's stole went from purple to red as the dark creature stabbed him viciously. He shouted, brandishing the cross at them, but it did no good. Roger lay dazed, his head having hit the wall when he fell, and I took a step towards him as I tried to help him, the creature still worrying at the priest. When Roger sat up, clutching his bleeding head, however, it seemed to catch the attention of the smaller one. It jumped on him, knife cutting his throat in a single practiced slice, and I backed away in horror as the other turned towards him, having finished with the bloody priest. Roger looked at me, confused and dazed, as the blood ran down his shirt. As the larger one joined in, the knife came down, and I saw it take Roger through the heart and drop him to the wall, twitching. I'm not proud of it, but I did the only thing I could think to do in that situation. I ran. I wasn't looking where I was going, though, and I hit the basement door, which was still wide open from the night before. When I stepped to the side, startled by the collision, I fell down the steps into the inky blackness of the basement. I was confused when I came to, my head hurting and my body aching. I didn't know how long I had been out, but one look up the stairs brought me back to reality. I saw the bulky spirit framed in the near blackness above, staring down at me as I sat in a pool of light from the basement window. His white face was the only thing truly visible, its features shifting and changing. The knife it held glinted wetly as it dripped onto the wooden stairs. I cringed as he took one slow step towards me. It began to walk down the steps in a slow, horror movie fashion, and I tried to make my body move so I could escape whatever this lumbering horror was. I pulled myself further into the basement, trying to hide under the dark stairs as the heavy footsteps of my pursuer came steadily down. How could its steps be so loud? Spirits didn't make noise. Not like this. I kept dragging myself, kept trying to escape, kept trying to find some magic portal to help me flee from this impossible situation. When my hand fell on the smooth metal handle of the shotgun, I felt some small amount of reassurance. It was useless, though. It was a weapon of the real world, but I suddenly felt powerful as I held it. I heard a step behind me and rolled to see him not 6 steps away from me. I leveled the shotgun at the creature, but his face registered nothing but the same ghastly commitment. He took a step, and I wrapped my finger around the trigger. If I was going to die, I would die with the sound of thunder in my ears. The gun flashed, lighting up the basement, and by that flash, I could see a giant hole as it appeared in the side of the spirit. It toppled to the ground, clutching its side, its mask stained red as something coughed and wheezed beneath it. I sat up, wanting to reach out and grab that mask and reveal whoever had been the cause of my torment. I forgot this when I heard steps bounding on the kitchen floor upstairs, pounding towards the basement. I looked around, trying to find an escape, and my eyes fell on the open closet to my left. I scuttled into it painfully, closing the door as whatever was coming down the stairs slid into the dark space and wailed its otherworldly wail. I peeked out, looking to see the other creature bent over the first. The one I had shot was not moving, and the second seemed to be mourning it as it bent next to it. I backed away from the door as it turned to look for me, knowing now that I was trapped. I had the gun, but who knew if it had actually ended the first one? I expected my back to strike the wall of the closet as I moved backwards, and I was surprised when it never happened. I was backing through a newly formed hole in the wall of my basement closet. A door seemingly opened there by magic. When my back finally hit the new wall, I saw that it was indeed a doorway. A door sitting open, which had swung out of a tunnel. Even in my fear, I found myself looking at the door, seeing that, when closed, it would fit flush against the wood, almost disappearing. I swung it shut, closing it softly, when I heard someone scuttling around near my hiding spot. I was left with nothing but the dark tunnel. I clicked the light on the shotgun barrel. Now, with the immediate danger outside, I used it to search the door for a lock or a bolt. I found a big rusty slide bolt on the back, and it looked like it would be capable of keeping out a small army. I drew it closed, hopefully locking the spirit inside the house, and turned the light deeper into the tunnel. I saw a path leading away from my basement and into the unknown. It seemed to be my only option, so I took it. Good evening, my little creeperonis. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's reading. If you'd like to support the show, head on down to Patreon. Those at our $5 limit, that's the Spooky Skeleton tier, have their names read out at the end of every video. Since there's no names being read out, you could be the first. Everyone likes to be first, right? Or you could always go to Amazon and buy a book. I've got a link over there that'll take you to all my books. As always, we appreciate you subscribing, and we appreciate your patronage. Until next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.